Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak, your podcast available every morning on Apple, Spotify or wherever you listen. It's Tuesday, the 25th of February here in London. I'm Caroline Hepker. Coming up today, Trump withdraws US condemnation of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, opting instead to align with Moscow. The US looks to impose more limits on China's access to semiconductors. Plus, the sound of silence. Artists including Annie Lennox and Damon Albarn release an album devoid of music in protest against AI copyright proposals. Let's start with a roundup of our top stories. The US has joined Russia in voting against a European-backed resolution at the UN. The two sides later aligned for the first time since the war started to approve a US resolution calling for a swift end to the conflict, but without assigning blame. This comes as French President Emmanuel Macron visited Trump at the White House. Speaking alongside the US President, Macron sought to make the case for deeper European involvement in any peace deal. His words are spoken by a translator.
I've spoken with some 30 European leaders and allies in recent days. We want to bring together these allies and share the same vision. This peace must not mean a surrender of Ukraine. It must not mean a ceasefire without guarantees. This peace must allow for Ukrainian sovereignty and allow Ukraine to negotiate with other stakeholders regarding the issues it affects. But it is also a country in which we need to shoulder our responsibilities so that we ensure security and stability for Ukraine and for the entire region. And for us Europeans, this is an existential issue.
But despite Macron's words, Trump on Monday appeared to speed ahead with his own plans to end the war without input from European nations or Ukraine, saying on social media that he's in, quote, serious discussions with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Separately, President Trump says that Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky may travel to Washington as soon as this week to sign a deal over natural resources. Germany's chancellor-in-waiting, Friedrich Merz, meanwhile, is in talks with the Social Democrats to approve up to €200 billion in special defence spending. Bloomberg understands that officials from Merz's Christian Democrats and the SPD are discussing ways to get around Germany's tight restrictions on government borrowing in order to ramp up investment in the German military. Ideas under discussion include a special fund for the new military spending and Ukraine aid, or adapting the so-called debt brake to allow for more defence spending. Donald Trump is planning to toughen Biden-era controls over China's tech sector. The president's team is sketching out more restrictive US semiconductor curbs and pressuring key allies to escalate their own restrictions on the country. Bloomberg understands US officials recently met with Dutch and Japanese counterparts to discuss preventing Tokyo Conductor and ASML engineers from maintaining semiconductor gear in China. Andy Budden, Equity Investment Director at Capital Group, says that China's broader prospects, though, are still positive.
The one thing that we can be sure of with China is that it is going to be a volatile market. And I would strongly encourage investors to really think about which of the companies that will do well over the longer term. But of course, we absolutely are going to see a lot of news flow on tariffs, on geopolitics. Investors just need to be ready for that and stay focused on the long term.
Capital Group's Andy Budden speaking there. Sources say that early discussions about sanctions on specific Chinese companies are also taking place in Washington. As well as curbs on China, Trump's administration is also going forward with scheduled tariffs. The president said that the levies were coming soon, despite an initial delay.
We're on time with the tariffs, and it seems like that's moving along very rapidly. We've been mistreated very badly by many countries, not just Canada and Mexico. We've been taken advantage of. We were led by, in some cases, fools.
Donald Trump went on to add that the US Commerce Department is currently calculating the rate it will impose on other countries and aiming to incorporate both tariffs and other barriers on US imports. Following the president's remarks, though, an anonymous US official said that the fate of a proposed special 25% levy on Canada and Mexico is yet to be determined. The European Union is expanding the list of US goods that it will target with retaliatory tariffs. Bloomberg has learnt that the bloc is broadening its plans to respond to US President Donald Trump's planned levies on steel and aluminium exports. The US measures could impact 28 billion euros worth of European exports. That is 4 times more than the last time President Trump went after the bloc's metals sector. The European Union is about to walk back key pillars of its planned ESG rules. Sustainability drives have been blamed by some business figures for holding back the EU's efforts to compete with the US and Asia. Bloomberg's James Wilcock has more now.
The EU has long planned to make companies legally liable if their supply chains are found to contain ESG breaches. But documents seen by Bloomberg say the planned rules are being redrafted. Now only large companies will be targeted. They're only responsible for direct business partners, and the fines will be lower. It's a major watering down of arguably the EU's flagship ESG policy. That in turn shows how member countries are lobbying hard for deregulation in response to the wave of American loosening rules. The final proposal is set to be made public tomorrow. In London, James Wilcock, Bloomberg Radio.
Those are our top stories for you this morning. Let's think about the markets. Yesterday, European equities ended in the red. The Xetra DAX, though, outperformed after the German election, ending up 0.6%. There was also a new closing high for Rheinmetall, up 6.4%. Key defence sector name. German 30-year bond yields also traded weak, rising 3 basis points. The news that the new government is planning this €200 billion defence fund. Meanwhile, US stocks fell in late trading. The Canadian dollar and Mexican peso also dropped after Trump talked about those tariffs going ahead next month. As for overnight tonight, US stock futures currently are up. MSCI Asia Pacific Index slumping the most in 3 weeks. The reports that, again, the Trump team is looking to toughen chip exports to China. That has affected the Hang Seng Tech Index. Japanese stocks have reopened after a holiday, with the Nikkei 225 down 1.2% this morning. Treasury yields continue to decline now, and the US dollar is actually steady, with the euro trading at 1.0477. So those are the markets. Well, coming up next, we're going to talk about what's been coming out of the White House, also those votes in the UN yesterday. Our senior editor for US economics and government, Derek Warbank, will be joining me in just a moment. But perhaps a little lighter note, this story caught my eye today. It's awards season. Have you noticed? There's a lovely piece on the terminal from Max Berlinger, who writes often for Bloomberg Pursuits. This one's called A Day in the Life of an Oscar Stylist. Apparently dressing celebrities has become a cottage industry, and those who are at the top of their game, this is the bit that interested me, their incomes can vary very drastically depending on, which client or prospect they have. But apparently customers who use stylists often pay for the look. So it's by look that you pay for. And apparently also the fee generally ranges from between $1,000 to $5,000 for preparing, an actor maybe to do a TV talk show or go to a premiere or do an interview. In some cases, though, the deals then are struck for the whole of a particular press cycle. I mean, now for the Oscars, there is, a campaign season, if it's the Oscars or the Emmys or the Grammys. Anyway, it's a really nice piece from Max Berlinger. It's also on the front of the Bloomberg .co.uk website if you're interested in reading that. Bloomberg Pursuits, something lighter. And of course, the Oscars, if you're thinking about it, coming up on the 3rd of March, isn't it? Right, let's turn our attention to our top story this morning. President Trump has cemented Washington's split from allies over Ukraine. The US and Russia voted together in the UN General Assembly and the Security Council, calling for an end to the conflict in Ukraine, but without condemning Russian aggression yesterday. Joining us now is Bloomberg senior editor for US economics and government, Derek Warbank. Good morning, Derek. Thank you for being with us to help us think through this. President Trump is now aligning, it would seem, with Russia's Vladimir Putin on Europe's worst conflict since the Second World War. What happened at the UN, and what was President Trump's explanation?
Well, Caroline, it was a stunning series of events at the United Nations. Look, the United States and Russia agreeing on any resolutions in this would be something quite to say. But certainly voting against most of the rest of the world on a resolution condemning Russia was something that a lot of people had not expected to see. We did see some explanation from the United States later. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, telling a conservative website, Breitbart, that something on the verge of they were looking at move forward, not looking back. Everyone can read the papers and see what started the war, et cetera, et cetera. This idea of like preserving some negotiating space and not antagonizing and things of that nature. But even that is a remarkable sort of come down for the U.S. administration, and very much, I think, emphasizes the point that we've heard a lot of Europeans make. I mean, I've talked to a lot of European diplomats in the last week over here in Singapore, and they're all telling me that regardless of whatever you think of the U.S. moves right now, they make very, very plain that if Europe wants to defend Europe, it needs to defend Europe and not wait for the United States to be around, because you cannot make the calculus, in their view, that the United States will be around.
Yeah, meanwhile, the French president was at the White House. Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, will be there on Thursday, we think. Will Europe then take responsibility for guaranteeing Ukraine's future security? That is a really big question.
Well, we've talked before about Emmanuel Macron's once more into the breach sort of efforts here, right? You know, he's sort of seeing a situation where he doesn't think that Europe has a seat at the table and going and inserting himself and giving himself that seat. Macron has certainly been the top one on this, but we've heard from Friedrich Merz, the new winner in Germany, who's looking to form his own coalition, saying, you know, very similar things, that Europe needed to step up. So that I would expect to continue. You've certainly seen similar language before from Sir Keir Starmer. So I would expect a little bit of a united front among the major European powers plus the UK as they're trying to align here. I think they're all sort of singing out of the same song sheet.
Putin has also welcomed this reset. He made some comments on Russian TV. I mean, it's also noteworthy, isn't it, that in the Security Council, it was Russia, the US and China that all voted for that measure.
Well, no surprise that he's happy right now. I did read some of the comments that he was making. Some of the suggestions, such as that the U.S. could maybe help Russia explore mineral rights in the bits of Ukraine that Russia is currently occupying, are probably not going to be welcomed in the U.S., I would imagine. But Putin is certainly finding himself in a different position. That having been said, there are trip hazards to this position. Look, the U.S. officials have said, Trump-appointed U.S. officials have said that they are open to easing on Russia, but they're also open to being stricter with Russia if Russia is not, willing to actually go into talks. And so far, Mr. Putin has not necessarily shown a giant willingness to get into talks in a serious way. And so if that happens, if you go through all of this exercise, you say, here's the most favorable set of circumstances you possibly could have wanted, and that's still not good enough for you, there is a possibility that at some point this warmth turns to frigidity, and in a real way. So there is a danger here of sometimes you get into into like this friendly confines, and it seems very comfortable. That may not last forever, and that's something that Vladimir Putin is going to have to take quite seriously.
In terms of how investors think about this, I mean, this is geopolitics. It's hugely important. You know, we're thinking about what feels like a really tectonic shift, doesn't it, in terms of the US's alliances. Derek, can you give me a thought on how investors might be thinking about this, businesses around the world, as we have to, take time to kind of recalibrate?
Sure. Look, my favorite thing to say about all of this, honestly, at any point is price and volatility, right? That's the number one thing that you can be certain of is increased volatility. So I think that's certainly something that we're seeing in there. I read an interesting quote in a Bloomberg story the other week that was talking about the oil market and was talking about how basically it's going kind of nowhere but in the most volatile way possible. I think you see that in a lot of different things, right? You see a lot of currencies that are moving by quite substantial amounts that maybe they haven't moved that way in months, maybe years, and you see all of this up and down. So I think that's the number one thing. There is a certain dividend to make if Europe gets to a durable peace, right? You know, that's been something that's been hanging, but is something that may not. My good friend Josh Rogan over at WP Intelligence was writing that he sees European defense as a play that some people are looking at here, because if Europe is actually going forward with staffing up its defense, then certainly that money is going to go somewhere. Yeah. So there are a lot of different ways that this can play, and I think somewhat durably. But Caroline, it all comes back to me for volatility. In an age of Trump, you have to be prepared to be surprised.
Derek, thank you so much. Yes, that's a good point, isn't it? And as Allegra Stratton pointed out yesterday in the Readout newsletter, if you read that, you know, going from not having to pay for defence spending then to having to factor in a cost for Europe is also a huge change. Derek, great to speak to you. Thank you for being with me. Bloomberg's senior editor for US economics and government, Derek Warbank. Now, more than 1,000 musicians are releasing a silent album to protest a proposed change in the law here in the UK, which they say will allow tech firms to train AI models on their copyrighted work more easily. Bloomberg's Tiwa Adebayo joins me now for more on this story. Tiwa, what is the UK government planning to change here?
Well, they're planning to change copyright law, and crucially, that will make it easier for AI companies and actually other tech firms to use copyrighted work to train their models without a license. It's not just music, it's everything from literature to journalism, basically everything that is in the public domain of the internet. So developers will be able to use creators' content to develop their models under the new rules. That's unless creators opt out through something called rights reservation. But critics are saying that in practice, this opt-out system would be incredibly impractical and very labour-intensive, and actually virtually impossible when you think about the sort of size and scope of the internet. So there has been an alternative proposal in the House of Lords for artists to opt in instead. But thinking about the consequences of these laws, they're quite far-reaching. So the content could also be used for companies for data mining, and actually even as a basis to generate new content. And that's why the law has been going through something called a consultation period in the UK, which actually ends today. It's received some quite high-profile criticism, especially from figures in the music industry, including the likes of Paul McCartney and Elton John. And then, of course, as you mentioned, there is this silent album released today called This Is What We Want. It's for charity. It includes artists like Annie Lennox and Kate Bush, and it features recordings of empty studio space and other performance spaces. And the track list actually spells out the British government must not legalise music theft to benefit AI companies. So I think it's fair to say they're not happy about the changes.
OK, so this is the proposal then and the pushback. Has the boat already sailed, though, in artificial intelligence? I mean, I'd argue maybe it has in print. There are a bunch of lawsuits, aren't there, already around what print content these AI models can use or have been using.
Well, in a word, yes, and it's a similar case in the music industry. They've already faced quite significant issues in this field, and they have been doing so for a number of years now. Actually, back in April 2024, there was the musician Drake. He found himself in quite a lot of trouble because he posted a track to his social media featuring an AI-generated version of the rapper Tupac's voice. Tupac obviously has passed away. So lawyers for Tupac's estate sent a cease and desist letter to Drake, and that video later disappeared from his social media. But artists like Drake are trying to sort of embrace the genre and use it creatively. Drake also is no stranger to AI-generated music. He actually sampled an AI-generated song about himself by an internet creator in his own music. So perhaps a bid there to sort of take back control. That's one approach. But music management groups don't seem to be as willing to adopt this technology. Actually, Universal Music Group, when they boycotted TikTok and they pulled their music catalogue from the app, they said AI was one of the three main concerns as to why they did that. Also, major music labels have sued two AI-generating music companies for copyright infringement of their recordings, and they said it took place at an almost unimaginable scale. So it's definitely already a live issue for both artists and music management companies, and that's also not to mention battles over AI-generated images and likenesses of artists and musicians, which have a much longer legal history too.
Yeah, OK, well, that's a whole other section, isn't it? Look, it's also not a kind of fluffy issue, is it, in the UK, because the creative industries are so important, actually, to Britain and I'm sure to lots of other places.
Definitely. In 2023, for example, the UK music industry alone actually contributed a record £7.6 billion to the economy. And these are the sorts of contributions that the government won't want to lose, especially now as they're struggling to produce the sort of economic growth that perhaps they might want. And I think that's why they've committed to this period of consultation to perhaps get music industry executives and musicians on side. But they're having a tricky time of it, actually. The CEO of the UK's music industry body, UK Music, described these changes as the government basically taking a punt against an already productive and successful industry. And for many artists, it seems really to just be a question of agency here. Actually, despite being a critic of these changes, Paul McCartney, for example, he actually has used AI in his music to recreate the vocals from an unfinished demo by John Lennon to produce a new song. Yes, he's used it, but he's a critic of these new changes. It's also important to remember that the UK has committed to being a real leader in the AI space. It's not long since they released their AI opportunities action plan, and this technology is being seen as a key driver of economic growth. So it could be that this new law, this new change to the law, is one of the steps that we need to get to that place of leadership. But those protesting the change definitely don't think it is.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.